Federal Reserve adopted new rules for trading last week, including banning the following: individual stocks, bonds, and mortgage-backed securities, cryptos and foreign currencies, short selling, margin and commodities, and sector funds. The new rules appear to be much stricter than those for Congress, or even proposed bans for that matter.
The new rules come after last year's controversy in which several officials traded positions just ahead of the Fed's extraordinary measures to help the economy through the COVID crisis. Republican strategist Melik Abdul joins us now to discuss. Melik, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
This is an interesting situation because Congress is supposed to be the democratic institution. Congress is supposed to be the one. This is the people's house. This is the place that's supposed to be responsive to politics, to the demands of the public, to the general will. And yet it's this kind of autocratic, removed, independent institution in the Federal Reserve that is moving more quickly when it comes to responding to public opinion. How do you account for the Fed being more responsive to the public than Congress?
Congress rules for thee, not for me. Well, that's not surprising at all. One of the things that I think this larger discussion of the issue of members of Congress and trading stocks, what I always like to talk about is that I actually think that members of Congress should be subject to the same rules as, for instance, political appointees. Many people know that if you're a political appointee in the federal government, there are certain things that you can and cannot do, and they're spelled out in ethics rule. Each year, the political appointees fill out, I think it may be called an SF-278, but what it is essentially is a form that has to go through your ethic professionals at your job to ensure that you're not involved in any type of, you're not having any type of cases or involvement in anything that's dealing with stocks themselves. I think if Congress adopted a similar measure where obviously things like, for those of us who participate in 401ks, that's a little different from the individual stock trading that members of Congress are able to do. I think that was back in 2020 when you had Senator Loeffler and a number of others. I mean, Senator Loeffler ended up becoming the big name that people reference, but you had other members of Congress who were also part of that same sort of investigation where they had to go back and clear up some of that. So I honestly think that the United States Congress should be subject to the same rules as members of the political appointees across federal government, but that the Federal Reserve is taking a more proactive approach than Congress really isn't something that surprises me at all.
Yeah, and this is an issue where, Democratic leadership, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, has been very unwilling, hostile even, to the idea of going down this road, despite this huge popularity for preventing members of Congress from engaging in the stock trade. This is popular with Democrats. This is popular with everyone you talk to. Everybody agrees. The people agree that Congress should not be involved in this sort of thing, but elected leadership and the Democrats have this, kind of stated commitment, I guess, to populism, and even Republicans to some degree, to preventing this collusion between Wall Street and the government. And there's no interest in doing it among the actual Congress.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about that, this is one of those instances where both sides of the aisle actually come to an agreement on this. Now, what I think, and I think many people who've been following this, the only thing that we can think of to justify why members of Congress would be okay with this is because there is a financial benefit. Going back to 2020, remember there were a number of members of Congress who were involved in stocks that may have been dealing with, manufacturing of vaccines or any type of the COVID kits and many of the other things that were out there. You had meetings and then you go back and you're able to actually just kind of dump stocks. That's why I say, and I think people should really look into this. That's why I say, if you were a political appointee in government, you were not able to do this. And you actually had to divest yourself from many of these stocks. The idea that members of Congress they continue to be able to do this, and there's bipartisan. Now, obviously, they would never publicly say that we're in agreement with Republicans or Democrats on any of these things, but they are connected because of the financial benefit. There is, and I would love to see an explanation even from Speaker Pelosi. What is the explanation why Congress is really slowing this process and really seeming as if they don't want to do this at all? If you can explain that it has anything to do anything other to do with money, then sure, I'm all ears. But right now, it seems like there is a financial benefit as the only reason why Congress is not pushing this, as they're ready to push many of the other bills that come before the House and ultimately end up in the Senate.
The only argument that she's made is that it's unfair that they shouldn't be trusted. Like, we've been elected to Congress, so you've put your trust in us to make laws. You must trust us to not rip you off at the same time. Elaine Laurier, who's a Democrat from Virginia, has said the same thing. She said, I'm voting against this because I think it's outrageous that the voters don't just trust us, which I can't think of a more disconnected thought from reality than the idea that voters would just simply trust the members of Congress in Washington to have their hand in the cookie jar and not take anything out.
I have not seen recent polling on this, but if we know over the course of the years, I think Congress's approval rating has been below 30% over the past several years. So the idea that the public actually trusts Congress is not really realized in any of the polling that's out there. Obviously, Republicans who, like, for instance, Republicans like Republicans, Democrats like Democrats. But when it comes to this issue of stock trading, I think that the American people across the board, and we've actually seen polling on this, where the American people are overwhelming in support of the Stock Trade Act. I think that's the name of the Stock Trade Act. But members of Congress, again, because of the financial benefit. Now, sure, some members of Congress, they get in there and they don't get into the swamp. They don't participate in the swamp as far as making millions of dollars. But we have lots of millionaires, and not just millionaires in Congress. We had people who came to Congress and became millionaires. So sure, the American people trust Congress probably as much as they trust media. And, as all of us are sitting here in media now, we can kind of laugh at that. But I reject the notion that somehow the American people are more trustful of Congress. They're not at all. And specifically when it's an issue like this, where they're able to benefit from things that the American people don't. And as I said, political appointees across federal government, I think they need to change the rules overall and make it a more fairer playing field. But this idea of being able to trade individual stocks, it should end immediately. And the American people should rise up. The American people should not rise up against it. The American people should actually protest this action in Congress.
Well, right, and the idea is that even trustworthy people, because of a conflict of the dynamics of conflict of interest, even a generally honest person might do something unethical if they were in a situation where they had information and they're the ones doing the rulemaking and they could financially profit in an underhanded way, that even an honest person would be tempted, so this shouldn't be allowed. Now, our political figures are less trustworthy, I think, than the average citizen of the planet, the average person. So of course they would be seduced by this, and they are over and over again. You talked about Loeffler and the other scandals. So it's not. It's ludicrous that you wouldn't even trust a generally honest person in this scenario.
Right, absolutely. And again, this is something that we should continue to talk about, not just in media, but the American people need to understand. This is something that is if you look at the polling and just go back to the polling on this, whether it's on social media or an actual polling by Washington Post or New York Times and many of these other institutions, these type of things get bipartisan support. But I think that Congress does what it wants to do. And the same goes for Nancy Pelosi. Keep in mind, Nancy Pelosi, they've passed hundreds of bills since Biden has been in office. She doesn't have a problem bringing any bill that her party supports before the House. There does seem to be an issue with this. And what I really hope that the American people realize is that this is one of the issues where we can actually rally around in a bipartisan fashion to say No. And I think that's what needs to happen. And unless that happens, Nancy Pelosi is not going to do anything because, as both of you have said, members of Congress really aren't interested in this at all. You may have the AOC wing or some of the more progressive wing who are really really out front being against this, but for the most part, they aren't the ones who are raking in millions at this point. Not to say that it won't happen in the future, right, but they're not the ones who are raking in millions, and people don't want to affect their direct deposit.
And as we think through how to write these bans, because I do think you're right that it's coming. Like they've resisted this as long as they can, and they can't resist it much longer. And we also have to focus on owning stock, and that goes to the point that Robby was making, that forget just trading stocks. Like that's a problem. Insider trading, that's bad. Obviously, that should be banned. But just owning the stock creates a conflict of interest. Let's say you own an Apple stock, and it was reported that Jon Ossoff has a blind trust, but he knows that he bought a ton of Apple stock at some point earlier in his life, and so it makes up a huge portion of his net worth. And so, if you know that you own Apple stock, and now you're talking to Tim Cook about legislation, it's in your mind that you own that stock,
right,
and that this legislation, this rule, you're questioning even during a hearing, could have some influence on the stock price, and you know that, and there's nothing you can do to unknow that. And so even the most honest person then is thinking about that as they're thinking through their public policy decisions, and that is corrupting. Just on its face is corrupting. It corrupts the way that you think about how the policy should be written. And so that's why I think we even have to focus on ownership itself. Like you shouldn't be able to own, say, Amazon stock while you're legislating Amazon. Melik, am I missing anything there?
Yeah, so I do agree with that, and I think, and that's why when I mentioned earlier about this distinctions that should be made between our retirement accounts, because of course through our retirement accounts we own stocks, but we don't get to individually buy and trade stocks in the same way. I think that should be separated from an issue, for instance, like you say, with Amazon. And I know it sounds boring, but if you are a political appointee across federal government, if there is a possibility that you can legislate any type of, make any type of ruling or anything that deals with a company like an Amazon or Facebook or anything like that, you have to divest yourself from those type of stocks. I don't know, well, I do know because it's a financial motivation, but this is something that members of Congress should also do. Having your money in, I get it, I understand somewhat how blind trusts work. But at the end of the day, if it's possible that a company or anybody that you've actually you've invested stocks in, that they can come before you in any manner, I think that Robby is correct. We need to actually start going after those. Members of Congress, they're going to protest against it. They're going to be totally upset about it. But at the end of the day, if you're talking about building confidence in the American people that Congress is a trustworthy institution, then the blind trust thing, that has to be at a minimum of what Congress can do. I think you're right, Ryan, that they're going to eventually get there, but it's taking them much longer than they should because it pays well for them.
We haven't even gotten to Joe Manchin's owning of a coal company. And when he gets pressed on that, he says, well, that's in a blind trust. What does that mean? Your son runs it. You know you own it. The blind trust. What's blind about it? It's right there in your disclosure. Oh, Lord. Anyway, Melik, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.